So by now we've covered a few different topics. We've covered the theory, just as a very basic theory of how light interacts with objects in the real world. That translates into render settings. We've done that. We've also talked about triplanar projections. We've talked about bitmaps and noises. What's cool is that now you have all the options on the table. So if you have a project, now you have the ability to pick whichever approach works best for that situation. And because you now know the techniques, that means you can make the best decision and save yourself a lot of time and also maintain quality for whatever that object needs to be. It's important to know that depending on the situation, the right technique will change, and it just depends on what's happening, what the object is, what the pipeline is. There's a lot of factors that go into it. But as a general rule of thumb, the best sort of pipeline that I try to rely on as much as I can looks something like this. For any object that I have, except for a character, I'm going to rely on triplanar projections as much as possible. The thing about triplanar projections is that they're really quick, and if you back that up with a strong texture library, it's hard to beat that much detail and that much control when you show up already prepared with those texture files in hand. It's a really hard thing to beat. So if you can do that as much as possible, it's a huge time saver. You don't need to worry about UVs. That takes up hours and hours of your time. And at the same time, it allows you more time to figure out where you want to go with an object. One thing that happens sometimes, and it's really frustrating, is when you're UVing something and you get done UVing and you don't have enough time to explore your different options and try to figure out what sort of texture might work best for an object. If you spend all of your time UVing and not making artistic choices, the end result isn't going to be as good. And that's the coolest thing about triplanar projections. You don't have to UV anything, and that allows you all this time to try out different ideas and find that one perfect texture, that one thing, that color, that sort of kind of rock, that kind of wood, whatever it is, that's perfect for that object. And you just wouldn't have that time otherwise. Now, if there needs to be some kind of decal or something that's really custom and specific about something, that's okay. I would just do that as a camera projection. You can still, get as much detail as you want via Photoshop, or if you can just get more supporting detail through a noise, that's also a great way to go, especially for those really high frequency things. So a combination of all those things usually works for about 90% of objects. Now, if there is an object that needs a lot of attention, that it just needs to be super custom and there's no way around it, well, what you can do is you can go through the whole process of trying to get away with it with just triplanars and noises and camera projections. You go through that as much as you can, and if it still needs something to be hand painted, then you can bake out the maps, or then you can UV it, bake out the maps, and then throw that into Substance Painter or Mari or Quixel or whatever you want to take it further. But honestly, just going straight to those painting apps, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense unless you're in video games. Video games is kind of a different scenario, but even with video games, things need to be UV'd, but you can still take that same approach within Painter or within Mari. You can do triplanars, you can do noises, things like that, and that'll help you cover ground really quickly within those apps too. So, in general, it still is kind of the same thing, except that texturing something in games just takes more time than it would in VFX or something that doesn't need UVs. Now, as for texturing for effects, this is an area that I think has a lot of potential. Imagine taking that sphere we just made, right? Imagine taking that sphere and baking out all the signals we just made through that noise and using that to drive some kind of simulation. There's a lot of potential in doing that kind of thing, and I don't see it done often enough. So if you want to take this further and you're an effects artist, then try to use these skills in texturing to really push the edge, push the envelope, do stuff that other people aren't doing. Like I said before, if you're the person that goes in there and just changes a few noise settings, and that's the basis of your effects, it's going to look identical to everyone else's stuff. And it's just obvious, and it's not as cool as somebody who sources their information from something that you can't replicate, like a photo, right? You just can't beat that randomness that a photo has. And so if you can take advantage of that in effects scenarios, that's a really cool thing to do. Now, as you can imagine, if triplaners are really at the center of a great texturing workflow, and I really think they are, then your ingredients, your photos, the texture library that you have is probably one of the most important things to organize, keep track of, and just make sure that you have really high quality stuff in there. Because if you have bad photos, if you have stuff that's low res or just not named or organized properly, it's not going to turn out as good. You're not going to be able to work fast if somebody hires you for a job. And so a big part of being a professional texture artist, if that's something you're considering on doing, is showing up ready with your textures and the things that you've prepared ahead of time. It's a huge difference between an amateur who just shows up and tries to figure it out on the spot versus somebody who has a whole library that they've made that belongs to them, that they show up with. And the cool thing about that too is that if you hire a professional texture artist who shows up with their own stuff, the stuff that they make is different than anyone else makes. Because if you're out there taking these photos yourself, you're sourcing in your textures, you're making these textures yourself, it's not something that anyone else can replicate. And the best textures that I've made, the best things that I've ever worked on, come from me taking photos with my camera, processing that in Photoshop, and then using that as triplaners or something like that to create whatever the object is. So here's what you need to do. If you want to take this further and you want to put something on your demo reel or just get better at texturing in general, use that wizard tower scene that I've included in the files. All those models are made completely from scratch. Myself and Yasser Shams made this collaboratively, and those models are there for you to use. If you want to use that on your demo reel, feel free to do so. If you want to use that for practice, that's exactly what it's there for. And it's really cool because if you want to add your own models in there or put your own spin on that scene, you can absolutely do so, and it's just the perfect scenario for testing out all these different ideas that we've been talking about. Thanks for following along. I had a really great time teaching this series. Texturing and shading is one of my favorite things to do in CG. It's where I got my start professionally. I was originally a texture artist, and so it's something near and dear to my heart, and I want to thank you for watching. Until next time, have a great day.